Hello, everyone. It's that time of the bi-weekly schedule again, where I'm going to make a video walkthrough of the recurring tutoring worksheets. I was supposed to only do the first 3 of these, but due to popular demand, I'm back and I'm going to be doing all of them throughout the semester. So if you've enjoyed listening to me so far, we have a few more weeks of that to go. Anyways, let's look at this worksheet. Now, this worksheet is covering primarily exceptions, at least in the first couple of problems, and then iterators towards the end. A lot of the questions on this worksheet are pretty simple answers. Like the answers are very small, but there's a lot of kind of conceptual stuff to go through here. So I'm going to go through exceptions a little bit as I do this worksheet, because it's something that students tend to be a little bit iffy about, and I think it's something we don't teach super well in this class. So anyways, let's look at this first question. Okay, basically, this is a kind of how to throw an exception question, just kind of a syntax question. So basically, we have this class here. It represents a Pusheen. We only care about happiness and food, and the happiness is proportional to how much food is fed. So if you look at the class here, you see it has an int happiness. Great, we're probably pretty used to that kind of thing at this point. When you create a Pusheen, happiness starts at 0. And then when you feed, you give it an amount, and the happiness is equal to 14 times the amount of food you give it. Why 14? I don't know. I didn't write this problem. It doesn't really matter. But the point is, we just give it food, and as we give it food, it gets happier and happier. Okay, great. However, you might consider some edge cases we could do with this kind of thing. So there's a few edge cases here. First of all, if we give it 0 food, it's going to reset the happiness to 0. That's not addressed here, but it's something you might want to look at. But in particular, if we give Pusheen negative food, it's going to give it a negative happiness, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? You can't give something negative food. So it doesn't make sense, right? So we basically want to prevent the user from doing something like that. And so how we are going to handle that is we're going to throw an invalid Pusheen exception. You've probably seen exceptions come up as you've been coding in IntelliJ so far. You've probably seen null pointer exceptions, array out of bounds exceptions, etc. Exception basically just means an error in Java. So anything that ends an exception is basically an error. It's something that you generally don't want to happen. And there are a whole bunch of different types of exceptions. There's invalid argument exception, illegal state exception, etc., etc. You'll get to know more and more of these as you write code that doesn't compile sometimes. So let's just say we have this exception called an invalid Pusheen exception, and we want to throw it whenever the Pusheen is fed a negative amount. In other words, whenever the user puts in something that's going to not make sense or break our program, we just want to basically error instead and don't let them do anything. Okay, so how are we going to do that? So we have this public void feed method, right, which is the same thing we had up here, and we want to rewrite it such that if they pass in a negative number, things are going to go wrong. So let's just write some structure here. I'm first of all just going to write if amount is less than 0, because that's what it means to be a negative number. We're going to do something. And if we don't do that thing, then we just want to have happiness set to be 14 times amount, just like it was before. So what do we want to do? If the amount we try to feed it is negative, we want to throw new invalid, what is it, Pusheen exception. Okay, and that's all we need to do. That's it. So this function will work exactly the same way as this one. If you pass in a positive number, right, we're never going to hit this if condition. And if you pass in a negative number, what's going to happen is going to throw an exception. Basically, the program's going to error. So if you were running this program in IntelliJ or something, what would happen is execution would immediately stop once you have the exception, and it would say, sorry, exception. So it terminates the program, right? Notice this is different than if you just said something like, if you said here like, oh, print out, invalid argument and then return, that would be different because the return is not going to end execution of the entire program. It's only going to end execution of this specific function. So that's why it's different. Some other syntax here, notice we have this throw keyword. Throw is just what you use to throw an exception of any kind. And then something I want you to notice here is we use the new keyword the way we do when we instantiate objects. And also notice that after invalid Pusheen exception, we have the parentheses, right? or, as Sigur Rós fans will know, the brackets, like the 2003 album. Anyways, why do we have that? And it's because this invalid Pusheen exception is actually an object itself. So when you say new invalid Pusheen exception, what you're doing is you're calling a constructor, right? The way you would any object. You're creating a new exception object, and then you are passing that exception object back. That's just a little bit of syntax detail. And exceptions behave pretty similarly to other objects. You can extend them, you can override them. So as you could imagine, for example, invalid Pusheen exception is not a real built-in Java exception. The exception you would normally pass in a situation like this is what is called an invalid argument exception. But maybe invalid Pusheen exception is a class which extends invalid argument exception. It's like a subtype of it. So we just throw that back. That's basically some of the kind of syntactic stuff here, but just remember exceptions really are just objects. And if you throw in, it just stops execution of the program. Okay, the next part of this question is, let's suppose we change this method signature. And let's say that we add this throws illegal argument exception thing to the method signature, right? In the same way that for a class, you might say like extends object or something. For a method, you can say throws invalid Pusheen exception or IO exception or just exception, anything you want like that, right? And then let's just assume that we've implemented it all correctly. Let's assume we just wrote the same thing here down here. Okay, so the question is, how does this affect the function? How does it change things? How does it affect the behavior of feed? And does it affect other methods that want to call feed? And so the answer is it does not actually affect the behavior of feed. You do not need to write throws invalid Pusheen exception in order to throw a Pusheen exception, right? Right here, we throw an exception without declaring we're going to throw an exception. That's a very common misconception. A lot of times students will write throws exception in a method and will end up breaking their code. IntelliJ also has a little bit of a tendency to tell you to add that to the method signature, but you should not because it breaks your code. What this line does here, what this throws invalid Pusheen exception does, is it basically tells any function which wants to call the feed method that, hey, this feed function might throw an exception, so it's your responsibility to catch it, basically. So imagine a situation where you have another method. Let's just call it, I'm not very creative, so I'll just call it push, because it's like Pusheen, whatever. Anyway, let's say that we have another method, and all this method does is it, will just call feed like this on, let's say -1, because that's an invalid argument, right? Okay, so if feed does not have throws invalid Pusheen exception, as is the case up here, then when you run this method will compile and everything, and when you run it, it will give a invalid Pusheen exception, right? Because this is an invalid argument. However, if it has this method in it, what this is telling again is it's telling any callee, any function which calls feed, which is push, it's telling this function that this method could throw an invalid Pusheen exception, and it is the responsibility of the function that is calling it to catch that exception. So this will not compile in its own right. If you tried to compile this code, if feed has this throws Pusheen exception line in it, what will happen is IntelliJ will give you a little red line and will say, oh, push has an unhandled exception. So what you need to do is you need to put feed in a try-catch loop, which is something we're going to see a little bit more in the next problem. So I'm not going to do it here. But that's the big difference. I really want to drive home this point of what this does, because I see students all the time in Gitlet end up writing methods that throw exceptions like this, and it looks all fine because it compiles, but then you run the autograder, and the autograder is not going to check for your exceptions, so then it breaks on the autograder, even though it looks like it should work locally. So in short, if you want to throw an exception, this is the syntax you do it with. Generally speaking, you don't have to add anything extra to the signature, but if you do add something extra to signature, that means that any function which calls that function needs to have a try-catch loop to handle that function. So that's basically the first part, and I will see you in the second one.